As if it weren't enough that he traced this sophisticated science all the way back to ancient Egypt, Brad continued to follow the clues and kept pulling the thread that unravels the sweater. What Brad discovered next was one for the history books. He traced the clues back to a date so remote in human history it makes the imagination real, and certainly upsets more than a few apple carts.
So when I started to realize that Ishtar statue with these big bulbous hips and this weird sort of female figure was a brainstem, it quickly made me think of one of the most famous sort of statues that you learn about in art history. In fact, in the art history classes that I took, it was the very first statue, the very first work of art that they teach you about in art history class. And I started to see more images of different variations of renderings of brain anatomy, and I came across this particular kind of wireframe stock imagery of the brainstem, and immediately I recognized this shape right in the middle as being extremely close and similar to the Venus of Willendorf statues, which are some of the earliest works of art of human history that go all the way to the Upper Paleolithic era. And the more I was looking at this, I had to compare it to an actual Venus statue, and it seemed to be almost identical in the shape of her body. And you have these kind of big wide hips, and the thalamus being these two halves of the thalamus. There's been at least I think 100 Venus statues found all over Europe. But when I was looking at this wireframe rendering of the brainstem, it seemed to be, again, almost undeniable that this shape, even the shape of her belly, it was showing a work of art that's from 28,000 to 25,000 BC, and it's depicting brain anatomy. And that was sort of an interesting revelation, and almost seemed kind of difficult to comprehend because it doesn't seem to fit in with our normal understanding of what we've been told about history. And so I started to look more at this Venus statue. I started to realize there was aspects of the Venus statue, the Venus of Willendorf in particular, that I hadn't noticed before, which is that she has arms. And I had never caught that in art history class, but she's got these spindly, disproportionate arms that she's resting on top of her breasts, and they don't fit her bulbous body shape at all. They're really skinny and sort of out of place. And again, it just made me think back to the trigeminal nerve. It made me think about the fact that these arms are coming right out of the pons. And in the Artemis and Diana statues, they're kind of at her side, but when you look at images of the trigeminal nerve, they're sticking out of the pons, and then they go out and the nerves go out to the face, and they do these other things. But so there's other Venus statues that have been found throughout Europe, and if you look at other of the Venus statues, you start to see other things that kind of clue you in to brain anatomy as well. But so you can look at the back of this Venus of Lespugue and see these lines on the back of what would be her legs, and they tie in extremely similarly to the lines that appear on the back of the brainstem. Now, there's some people that have suggested that these lines are representative of a skirt or a dress. But in my mind, I think that seems kind of strange because you don't see them carrying around to the front of her legs. You just see them on the backside of her legs. And again, we see it's more subtle on the Kostenki Venus, but you see these lines happening back here. And again, in both of these Venuses, you see this sort of bulbous rear end. You see these big bulbous butts. And that would again be the place where the cerebellum attaches to the cerebral pedicle and makes this kind of, overly large hip shape. And we see that in all the Venus statues, for the most part, is that they have these strange, large back ends that tie in extremely well to where the cerebral pentacles attach to the cerebellum. Now, the oldest Venus of them all is the Venus of Hohlefels, and it's considered to be 35 to 40,000 years old. And when I was looking at this one in particular had some dead giveaways that it was representing brain anatomy. And if you look at all these different representations of brain stems, you'll start to notice that the pons, the bulbous sort of torso section that we've been talking about, always seems to have these sort of striations or these stripes. Different people render them different ways. And if you look at a photograph like here, you'll see that those stripes are there. The artists are rendering what they're looking at. And if you look at the Hohlefels Venus, you can still see these same sort of ribbony striations that go across the stomach of the Venus. And another interesting point about this Venus is that where the vagina would be on the Venus is exactly where the anterior median fissure is in the brain, right here on the medulla oblongata. And there's even sort of a dark spot directly right there where the pons and the medulla oblongata kind of meet, and you see a sort of very similar sort of darker spot right where the vagina of this Venus begins. So the more that I looked at this Venus, and again, this is the oldest work of art representing a human figure that we've found, I think it's not that difficult to associate this imagery with brain stems, with brain anatomy.
If the very first, or at least the oldest yet found art, carries this ancient and thus far secret message, and one of such a sophisticated scientific nature, then what we've always thought of as art and its place in primitive culture, in fact the very notion of a primitive culture, instantly flips, restructures itself, and takes a new place on the map of meaning. Another example of ancient art that provides evidence of a missing chapter in history, and in the history of science.
The more I started to familiarize myself with brain anatomy, and the more I started to recognize shapes and forms in classical works of art, this point really just kept coming back and kept coming back, that our ancient ancestors knew far more about not only brain anatomy, but they knew about brain anatomy that was dealing specifically with consciousness, as we've seen in Michelangelo's painting of the creation of Adam and Gerard David's painting of the transfiguration of Christ. Artists were not only depicting brain anatomy, but they were depicting brain anatomy in relationship to divinity, in relationship to God. And these Venus statues are doing the same thing. And the artwork that we're seeing showing brain anatomy isn't just doing it for the sake of facts and just cataloging this is what parts of the brain look like. They're doing it for a very specific reason, to highlight this knowledge that we all carry this mechanism and this machine work in our brains, in our bodies, in our heads, that is able to connect us to higher levels of consciousness, that's able to give us a receiver to receive higher levels of consciousness and to expand and unfold. And some people might call that higher level of consciousness God. Some people might call it just enlightenment. But whatever you want to call it, I think we can clearly show from the artwork of our ancestors that they were trying to communicate something to us about how each one of us is capable of reaching these higher levels of consciousness and reaching these higher states of being, all through ourselves, all through our own person, without any sort of other parties involved or any sort of institutions. That whole idea that the kingdom of God dwells within you. The body is a temple. These sort of things you start to realize are not just fancy sayings that we like to say, but they are scientific truths about how human beings operate and how our consciousness operates within this body, and that the body is not something to be cast aside, but that the body in itself is a vehicle for the transformation and the unfoldment of consciousness.
It might be correctly said that the ancient science conveyed timeless truths about the nexus or connection point between mind and body, or consciousness and the physical universe.
From what I have found, a major tenet, if not the main tenet, of the mystery school teachings was this science of consciousness, was this science of understanding how human beings achieve a higher state. These Venus figurine statues weren't just about fertility, but they were about brain anatomy, and not only just about brain anatomy, but about brain anatomy that deals specifically with consciousness.
So our suspicions about a scientific encryption in ancient art and architecture were beginning to look like they were on solid ground, and that there was going to be a significant bit of evidence that would testify to a missing chapter in the history of science and in human culture. Ancient art proved to be an unexpected doorway to ancient science, but the science seemed to be intimating or indicating a deeper mystery still. What if this culture has been grossly misunderstood? And what we've been thinking of as proto-religious symbols are actually these ingeniously approachable schematics of consciousness itself. What if this were not proto-religion, but something more akin to a science? A science that focuses on the other universe, the inner universe of consciousness. Could it be that these surface symbols, the netters and their relationships with one another, were actually schematics of a sort, ingenious dynamic models that describe the most fundamentally important thing that a person can know, the mysteries of one's own consciousness, the nature of consciousness, and the place that consciousness occupies in the material world? What if, instead of a nonsensical bunch of proto-religious gibberish, this culture was expressing an ancient and lost science?